Hey, it's Verity from the creative team and welcome back to the Wow Embossing Palette YouTube channel. I love to add dimension to my cards in many different forms, but sometimes your card can get a bit too bulky with so much dimension. Well, today I have 3 ways to add dimensional heat embossing, but without adding any extra additional bulk to your cards. These are great for adding more interest to your laid cards or even one-dimensional cards. For the first technique, we are just going to use repeat stamping and heat embossing to create additional dimension with your heat embossing. Unfortunately, my camera hadn't started recording to begin with, but I have stamped the Altenew Bamboo Rose stamp set onto white card with Wow Clear Ultra Slow Dry Embossing ink. This was then covered with Caraco, I hope that's said right, embossing powder, which is inspired by Catherine Pooler, and was heat set with my dual speed heat gun. Now I have used my MISTI to stamp the first layer and I left the stamps on the MISTI door in the same position. So now I'm placing my card back into my MISTI and I'm stamping back over the top of the heat embossing with clear embossing ink again. Because my stamps hadn't been moved, I'm able to do this. This will allow you to add more embossing powder over the top of the original stamped images. So I've covered the panel again in the same embossing powder and I've heat set it again with my gum. Now I repeated this about 4 times, but you can do it as many or as few layers as you like. It's entirely up to you. Now you may find it hard to see the dimension at the moment, however I'm now repositioning my stamps to fill in the gaps. So once I've stamped these images in clear embossing ink and then covered with the same powder, you will see the difference between the 2 sets of embossing and see the dimension. So as I heat set the new embossed roses, you can see in comparison to the old embossed images that the design is not as strong as it doesn't have as much dimension. So I've continued adding layers and filling in the gaps to create a dimensional background panel. For the second technique, we are going to create a dimensional die cut without having to layer up loads of die cut pieces, which would add bulk to your card. So I've die cut the Altenew Thanks die from white cardstock and using my clear slow drying embossing pad, I'm smooshing the ink pad down onto the card to transfer the ink. Over a piece of printer paper, I'm covering this with splash embossing glitter, which again is inspired by Catherine Pooler, and heat setting this with my heat gun. Now to add more dimension to the die cut, once the die cut has been cooled down, I'm smooshing with my ink pad down onto the die cut to add more ink. Now I have 2 ink pads, one for clean embossing and one for messy embossing like this. With my messy embossing pad, I'm not fussed if any ink or glitter gets transferred onto it. This also means I won't transfer any of the glitter onto a stamp when adding ink when I've got a clear embossing pad as well. So I've covered it in the same embossing glitter and I've heat set it once more. Now you'll want to do this at least 4 times to start getting more dimension, but again it's up to you how many layers you want to do. For the last technique, we are going to add faux dimension to our heat embossing. So with this technique, the trick is to add a dark shadow beneath the heat embossing to create that appearance that the heat embossing is floating off the background. However, to get this look, we have to stamp the shadows first before we heat emboss. So I've placed the bold leaf stamps from the Altenew Leaf Canopy stamp set onto a piece of white card in my MISTI. Next, you'll want to stamp the shadows in a dark colour. So here I went for Juniper Mist from Catherine Pooler Designs. Once the background panel is covered with your shadows, place the panel back into your MISTI and make sure you clean your stamps really well and that they are dry. This is really important because we're now going to start heat embossing, so we don't want to add any moisture to the card panel to any areas where we don't want the heat embossing. To add the heat embossing, we need to stamp the leaves again, but not directly in the same position to get this dimension. So initially align up the stamp with the same design on your background panel, but before you close your MISTI door, we need to move its position slightly. So I'm just shifting the stamp up and then to the left slightly. So some of the dark stamping peeks out from underneath the stamp. Once happy with the amount of shadow, close the door and then stamp the leaves once more into clear embossing ink. The leaves are then covered with Angel Eyes embossing powder and heat set. You must choose an opaque embossing powder though for this technique, so that the stamping beneath does not show through your embossing. So as you can see, it now looks like we have a leaf that is floating on top of the card panel. To finish the cards off, I've created a stencil background using a Kezia Art leaf stencil, using a couple of inks from Catherine Paula. So I'm ink blending Aquatini, All That Jazz and Daydream using a blending tool to create an ombre background. Then this card panel was then cut down to adhere onto a 5.5 by 4.25 inches card base. I kept a circular design to these 3 cards, giving a space to add the sentiment and allowing it to stand out from the busy pattern backgrounds. For the shadow embossed background, I'm using the big Hello Sugar Script die, and die cut this out of Gina K Sea Glass cardstock. As my heat embossing is dimensional without any bulk, it meant I could add a layered sentiment up instead. Before I did that, I'm just ink blending some Daydream ink onto the bottom to add some more definition to the sentiment for it to stand out from that background. All the sentiments were adhered to the circles, and these were foam mounted onto the card panels. And for a little more interest, I've embellished the cards with Morning Dew crystal drops. I hope you found several ways to add dimensional heat embossing to your paper crafts, but without adding any extra bulk. These 3 techniques are so easy to do, but can add a lot of punch. Let me know below which is your favourite technique. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up, and why not subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit that bell icon so you'll be notified when the next video is up. If you want to check out my personal channel, Pretty Little Button, I've also included a link here as well as down below. Also, why not check out this other video for some more inspiration. Until next time, happy crafting!